Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We are continuing our reading of Iqbal's Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, and in the last session we had stopped here. So today we are starting from thought is therefore the whole in its dynamic self-expression, appearing to the temporal vision a series of definite specifications. So temporal vision is a sort of an abstraction from the whole, in a sense, and focusing on that particular thing without its context, I guess. So temporal vision as a series of definite specifications which cannot be understood except by reciprocal reference. Cannot be understood except by reciprocal reference. Whole in its dynamics appearing to them as a series of definite specifications. Those definite specifications cannot be understood without reference to the whole. Cannot be understood in their entirety or in their essence. Their meaning lies not in their self-identity, the meaning of definite self-specifications, the meaning of particulars, but in the larger whole of which they are the specific aspects. So this is connected to the previous metaphor of seed and tree, as we saw. In the previous paragraph, he said that in its essential nature, then thought is not static. It is dynamic and unfolds its internal infinitude in time, like the seed. So seed is the whole, which from the very beginning carries within itself an organic unity of the tree as a present fact. So there are a few things. We have discussed this before, but just to expand on it a bit more, elaborate on it. So thought is as a whole. So thought now, as we have seen several points that for Iqbal and Hegel, the whole really is all there is. Whatever there is the whole. And this whole there's no outside of this whole. And this whole is what Hegel and Iqbal call infinite. And finite is anything which is not the whole. So in this sense, infinite doesn't mean that which never ends. But infinite for Hegel and Iqbal merely mean all that there is. And there's no outside of this all that there is. So whole, infinite, reality, thought, being. They are all different manifestations of that whole. And that whole, primarily for Iqbal and Hegel, is thought, and being is a particular manifestation of that thought. So that's one thing. And the relationship of whole, particulars are specific manifestations of the whole. And in a sense, this whole, if we liken it to a seed, then seed is all it is, and then there are different manifestations, and that all manifestations then fully actualize in a tree. In a similar way, thought is not static, it is manifesting itself, it is expressing itself, it is actualizing itself, and those expressions, actualizations, are different manifestation of this whole. And in their reality, particular manifestation cannot be really understood without reference to the whole. Obviously, the whole is relative in the sense that the whole, a particular whole can be a particularity with reference to certain other whole. So we can think of larger and larger wholes until we come at all that there is. And one way to understand this relationship between particular and whole, as we said in the case of seed and tree, is through Aristotelian notion of potential. Potential and actual. So seed is a potential tree, and when it expresses itself, so there's a process here, and then it actualizes itself. So in a sense, seed is tree in itself here. But when it expresses itself and become tree, it becomes tree for itself. And for Hegel, in contrast to Kant, thing itself in itself is an abstraction So thing in itself is an abstraction in the sense that thing in itself for Hegel is thing as seen without its manifestation. for Hegel, the real thing, then, which is actual, is sum total of its manifestations or actualization. That's one thing. In terms of understanding, Hegel's point is that you can't understand something, a thought or being or a sentence, without reference to its larger whole or context. And the final understanding, by the same token, or absolute understanding, can't be achieved without understanding things with reference to the ultimate whole. Ultimate whole, which is the infinite or the reality as a whole, or the final, or the original seed, so to speak, of everything which is manifesting or has manifested in this universe. In this sense, Hegel's holism or contextualism is an extreme form of holism, which is part and parcel of modern philosophy and sociology and other disciplines. This is an accepted effect nowadays, and Hegel had a huge influence on that. But Hegel's holism is the extreme form, because for Hegel, really, you can't have the final understanding if you don't understand things in the context of all that there is. And similarly, for example, you can't understand a sentence really without understanding it in the context of a paragraph. You can't understand the paragraph without reference to understanding it with reference to the chapters and sections, and finally the book, the whole book. Hegel's point is that this sentence can't fully be understood without reference to the whole book of reality. But in more moderate forms, this holism is nowadays, I think, mostly accepted as a fact. So in philosophy, for example, you can see that in Heidegger, later Heidegger, and in pragmatism. In mainstream philosophy, you can see it in later Wittgenstein and his idea that you can't understand a sentence or a language game without reference to a form of life. Similarly, coin, for example, you can't understand sentence without without reference to other sentences in that language, for example. So that sort of holism is And obviously then they make a distinction between implicit and explicit and background understanding and all that. So whenever I'm understanding a sentence in a language, I'm relying on a background understanding, which sort of in a nutshell contain the background or the context in which that sentence has to be explained. But this background knowledge can be implicit knowledge, so it doesn't have to be explicit knowledge, for example. But Hegel's contextualism or holism is very extreme in the sense that you can't have real understanding without understanding everything with reference to the whole, all that there is. And the whole in itself is an abstraction, so it's the whole is really at the end of the day, the whole is itself is an abstraction, whole in itself, abstraction. And in reality, the whole is collection of or sum total of its manifestations. And if thought is dynamic and is still manifesting itself, then until it has completed its manifestation, no thought can be understood fully. That's why you have historical relativism in Hegel. So the whole is itself trying to understand itself, and the specific things within that whole are also understanding them is an ongoing process. And probably the full understanding will only come when the whole has manifested itself fully, that is, the potential has become fully actual. And then I guess the motion will stop, because the reason there is a movement is because there is a lack of understanding or the lack of realization. So once it has fully realized and fully understand itself, then there's nothing else. Like, at least in theory, that's what should happen. And that's why last time I said that even though Hegel is a philosopher of motion and movement and history and all that, his Aristotelian bias is still there, because when thought becomes fully actual, then it should come to halting, basically, or until the motion is fully finished and the thing is actualized, that is, motion is gone away and this whole is stationary, you can't understand yourself fully, or the whole cannot understand itself fully. So the Aristotelian bias is there. So thought is therefore the whole in its dynamic self-expression. The thought is the whole which is expressing itself, manifesting it, appearing to the temporal vision as a series of definite specification, which cannot be understood except by its reciprocal reference. That is, with reference to the whole as a whole. Their meaning lies not in their self-identity, not in their specificity, but in the larger whole of which they are the specific aspects. So that's Hegel's. And now he's trying to sort of find an Islamic version or Islamic justification for such holism or contextualism. So I had said last time that we are going to do that today, but I think we'll start this in the next session. The larger whole is to use a Quranic metaphor. So we'll start from here, inshallah.